Larry Gorenflo and Rich Cincotta, the editors of this Springer volume, as well as Chris Small, who is a contributor to the volume, to come give us a snapshot and a slice of that, because it's a very rich volume with many contributors, and I think we'll get a sense of that, but wanted to also delve deep into some of the specific expertise of our speakers. We're sitting at the center, as I think many of you know, the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson by law, nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum to bring the worlds of scholarship and policy together. And this is an example, I think, where we have a new book that's come out from the research community and trying to understand some of the complex connections between humans and ecosystems and biodiversity in particular. And that is an important book within that scientific and research world, but one that we also want to be sure to go the extra step to try to understand what this means for in a variety of contexts, including a practitioner context, including a policy context, including a journalism context with Peter Sawyer here and company. So we want to really have this broad cross-cutting discussion. And so we're very pleased that the gentlemen have joined us for today's discussion. Our environmental change and security program really tries to facilitate these discussions across issues of environment, population, health, development, foreign policy, and security policy. And like so many of our meetings, we're very grateful to the collaboration and support from USAID and their Office of Population and Reproductive Health. It's terrific that Heather Diagnos is here from that office today, whom we work most closely with. I would also be remiss if I didn't say a warm welcome to Tom Lovejoy, who's been with us since 1994 in our program, providing guidance and advice. And then, as you all know, since you're here interested in biodiversity, somebody who has a bit of history in contributing to that literature. So, Tom, it's terrific to see you as well. We want to get quickly to our speakers, and you had an opportunity to pick up their bios, so I won't read them to you, but I'll highlight the fact. Rich Cincotta, kind of working down the row here. Rich Cincotta is demographer-in-residence at the Stimson Center. We're also very pleased to have him working with us here as a consultant at the Wilson Center, looking at demography and security issues and a range of issues. But this is another kind of part of Rich's past as a population ecologist originally by training, and so contributing in a different literature area as well. So it's great to have Rich join us. Chris Small is a geophysicist at Lamont Doherty Earth Observation, the lab up in New York, Columbia University. It's a great campus if one can get there, because you impart away from everybody else, and it's a terrific place where some very, very smart people are working. I have had the good fortune of going up and talking to folks. His current research interests are focusing on measuring changes at Earth's surface and understanding the cause and consequences of these changes. Really looking forward to Chris talking about his chapter. And then finally, Larry Gorenflo is returning to the center, someone we've had now many years ago as a speaker when he was working here in town at the Nature Conservancy. He's now up in Pennsylvania at Penn State University, where he's associate professor of landscape architecture. And so it's terrific to have Larry back at the center as well. So, Rich, I think I throw it to you first to get us started.
I think I'll start from up here. First of all, thank you, Jeff, and thanks to the Wilson Center. Thanks to the Environmental Change and Security Project staff. Kaylee, thanks for arranging everything. And for our speakers, Larry and Chris, for showing up and taking the trip. It's nice to have them here. I got a few emails at some point that made me think we weren't going to have a full staff here, but it worked out. Let me start by, I guess I should key this thing up. I can do this. Of course, this is about the launch of a book, Human Population, Its Influence on Biological Diversity, one in a very large series of ecological studies that's published by Springer. Several appear every year. This is number 214, but there's only a few of them that actually focus on human population, or I should say the human as a species. And this is a little bit of a turn of events for Springer. If one looks at the other titles, they're much more in the realm of ecology, what ecologists are familiar with. The series analyzes and synthesizes scientists' understanding of natural and managed ecosystems, their constituent species, their resources, all at very different scales, all the way from the biosphere level to communities, to populations, to individual organisms, and even to the molecular level. The editor's objectives, when we took this on, was to focus on human population density and growth, which are people call sometimes the Malthusian parameters of population, and to demonstrate ways in which these could be used to identify changes in the viability of native species, or more indirectly in changes in ecological systems or changes in habitat quality. So we were looking for any type of study that could do that at any level. And this was a little harder than we thought. And what we had to do ultimately is go to not only to academics, but to NGOs, to environmental NGOs to a great deal. Larry at the time was working at Conservation International, and also to specialized institutes in universities where this kind of interdisciplinary research was being done. We had to not only appeal to ecologists, who would be the usual suspects, but also to social scientists of different ilks. So I'd like to thank the 28 authors that contributed to this volume, and many of them are geologists and other types of social scientists, anthropologists, as well as population biologists and different types of ecologists. And I'd also like to thank some people who helped along the way quite a bit. One is Andrea Schlitzberger at Springer, who kept this going over many years and helped Larry and I out frequently and kept us on cue, so to speak. And also to Martin Caldwell, happens to be here today, who's an ecologist, a physiological plant ecologist in his own right, a very well-known one, and he had made substantive contributions in his editorial role as editor of the series. And now I'm try to go right to the book as much as I can and quickly flip through the chapters without saying much about them. But the book itself, the way Springer is doing it is, yes, it can be purchased at a high price, but it'll also be downloaded as an ebook, and each of the chapters can be individually downloaded. And when I looked at the site, I find that there's hundreds of people have already accessed chapters, which is really quite an interesting turn of events for in publication. So this is where it's going, and I think Springer's probably ahead of the ball game a little bit. Despite the fact that it was not created for policymakers, that the book is a scientific volume. It's geared toward researchers. It's geared toward establishing almost a handbook for this field, and also to conservation planners and managers who might find some of the methods useful and the conclusions revealing. Despite that, there are a few Washington-type policy messages. They're very general, but I think they're useful. And one of them, the first, is that by both direct and indirect means, changes in local human population density can be a strong indicator or strongly linked to the viability of populations of native species. Now, that said, there are studies in the book that show that various forms of human activity and their chemical and energetic byproducts can also strongly indicate the viability of populations of native species, even at low levels of human density. So you have both of these things, and maybe that's the double whammy of biodiversity, that settlement patterns, settlement density, also these chemical byproducts and changes in the landscape made from our commercial reasons or urban growth, extension of urban growth. All of these things can have strong effects on native populations. And that's, when I say effects, it means that not only can native populations decline, but also some individual species actually grow larger in the niche that humans have provided. Not to mention the invasive species that humans tend to bring in one way or the other. And thirdly, scale matters. Local analyses and effective responses by conservation managers to ecological problems typically are typically very different than analyses and policy prescriptions at other levels, higher levels. And quite frankly, those are not inconsistent with each other. That what we see conservation managers do at a local level may not correspond to policy prescriptions regionally or nationally or globally, but that's the way it is. Those things are, at different levels, may look very different and still be effective. So I'll quickly zip through these, as I said, as I promised I would, until I encountered this slide here. And the first, what we did is we divided the book into two large sections, then finally a discussion section. And the first section is really about global type analyses, theoretical looks at different types of systems. And the first is projecting a gridded population of the world using ratio methods of trend extrapolation by Lee Hachadorian, Stuart Gaffin, and Robert Engelman. And here's one of the graphics from it. And what basically they see is that as population grows, it'll grow another billion, probably between 2011 and 2025. There will be increases, rapid increases in population and increases in density, and that will accompany decreases in population density, and that are quite stunning, and you can see them in blue there as well. So it's a mixed bag for the future, though human population is likely to continue its growth for some time. I'm going to let Christopher Small talk about his chapter, The Human Habitat. And the next is Behavior Mediators of the Human Population, Effect on Global Biodiversity Losses, and by Jeffrey McKee and Erica Chambers. And McKee and Chambers' work is largely modeling effects that seem to explain changes in biodiversity at a national level all around the globe. And one of them is species richness, one of them is human population density, and the other is agricultural density or agricultural land use. Anyway, I think it's an interesting chapter, and that's his 2 words. And next is my own chapter, The Biological Diversity That is Humanly Possible, 3 Models Relevant to Human Population's Relationship with Native Species. And in it, I take on another kind of modeling, way to model these changes and model human density and population growth. And I look at our body weight as a possible explanation of our impacts. Secondly, I look at, I have to remember what I did. I looked at the increase in intensity of production, that throughput that that humans produce as we try to increase production. And thirdly, I look at the location of human settlement and hopefully provide researchers with some way to hypothesize changes that they might expect as human population spreads and increases in its density across the landscape. Next of all, we have a very interesting paper on biodiversity on the urban landscape. I hoped that Kathy would come today, but it's by Caitlin Slavich, Paige Warren, and Stuart Pickett, and it's basically a review of urban ecology, its implications for biodiversity or native species populations around urban areas, and it uses data from the Baltimore Ecosystem Study and the Central Arizona Phoenix Study, both of which are National Science Foundation funded long-term ecological research projects. Next, indicators for assessing threats to freshwater biodiversity for humans and human-shaped landscapes. Robin Abel, Michelle Time, and Bernard Lerner. And this is a review of methods of assessing aquatic biodiversity, losses and or the quality of those systems, and also a look at using human population density as a proxy that you could managers could use in areas that are very difficult to access. Next, a cross-cultural analysis of human impacts on the rainforest environment in Ecuador, which is by Flora Liu and Richard Billsborough. And in it, the authors take a look at 5 indigenous populations in that part of the Amazon, and they make some assessment of their demography, the implications of that demography on the household level, economic structure, and further look at what those impacts might be from those from household economics. Human demography and conservation in the Apache Highlands ecoregion, U.S.-Mexico borderlands, and that's by Larry Gorenflo, and I'll let him go over that in a few minutes. Long-term ecological effects of demographic and socioeconomic factors in Wolung Nature Reserve, and that's by Li An, Mark Linderman, Guangming He, Zhiyun Ouyang, and Jianguo Liu.
Did you practice those actually before you?
No, but I practiced for 2 years in China. What happened? This is an excellent. I'm sorry. This is an excellent look at a very applied look at what goes on among settlements in and around the Wolung Reserve, and it estimates the impact which one might expect from tweaking different variables in that system, and the species that people are looking at is a linked ecosystem of pandas and their reproductive and foraging habitat, which is in a large bamboo forest. Next, exploring the association between people and deforestation in Madagascar, and Larry's going to cover that in the next few minutes. And that's by Larry Gorenflo, Catherine Corzon, Kenneth Chamitz, Grady Harper, Miroslav Honzak, and Burke Osler. And I did practice that.
Excellent.
Yes, thank you. You get the award for the most accent marks in your chapter. I'll let Larry do that. And finally, our conclusion chapter is by 2 geographers, a couple natural and human systems approach toward biodiversity, reflection from social scientists. And that chapter looks back at a 2001 National Academy study and discusses some of the challenges encountered in taking on a human-focused perspective in ecological research in general. And they reflect on the chapters and what they have done. And it's an interesting way to cap it off. And with that, I will transcend to Larry and give him the podium, and we'll hear a few things, perhaps more in depth about some of these studies.
that it? I think it should be
Right there?
this one, maybe. Yeah.
And then can you get it? Right
There it is.
Down there.
All right. Thanks very much, Rich. Excuse me, and thank you all for coming. You know, it's they say you've got about 30 seconds to attract people's attention to a talk, and part of the attraction I was hoping would be the black and white figures that I've so elegantly scattered about this. The book sort of changed about 2/3 of the way, or 3/4 of the way through, and we had access to color. And I do a lot of mapping, so color would have been a great thing for me. However, I did not have enough time to convert them to color after, either for the publication or even for this talk. So it's a kind of a film noir type of a presentation with these two. And the other is that I don't know if you can tell or not, but this is actually done in portrait as opposed to landscape, because the maps tend to be better in portrait, which I think that coupled with the black and white will maybe give people a cause for to reach for the air sickness bags or something. But in any event, it's nice to be here, and I very much appreciate Jeff hosting this, and also Springer for publishing what we feel is a very nice book. I'm going to talk about two different places. In fact, probably the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and Madagascar have never actually been discussed in one presentation before. So I'm stretching, I suppose, a little bit. But I had initiated the one in the Apache Highlands as a part of I guess just after I had left the Nature Conservancy and was on my way to Conservation International, and I was involved in a project with the Conservancy where they were actually trying to introduce increasing attention to human population and in the context of their ecosystem planning documents. Excuse me. I got to Conservation International, and my new boss came down to me one day and said, you know, we've got this study of Madagascar. And I said, geez, that's really good. And he said, I wondered if you could sort of front it, because the person who was fronting it has just left. And I said, well, I've never been to Madagascar, and I've never really worked in the area, and I don't know much about it. And he said, well, it's fine, then you'll be a perfect choice for this. So I ended up sort of fronting that, and I'll talk about the co-authors briefly on that, because it was a very strong team, and I think the paper worked out in a very nice way, in large part to the many contributions that they made. In any event, as I sort of tried to put these two papers together, I looked for some basic questions, I suppose, and to see if there was any sort of connection between the two. And I think there are, and there are these three questions which you see up on the screen. They're generally speaking, I think at least the first two are a lot of the questions which people who look at these sorts of issues ask all the time. And then the third is coming from my NGO background. I'm in a university now, but I'm less interested in writing things that go on a shelf and more interested in coming up with some ideas about what we can do for our future in terms of conservation. So I'm kind of looking for recourses in a sense, and I'm hoping that maybe at least this will provide some of the basis for that. So let's go to conservation setting 1. You know, I made some notes here, but then I've got the screen down there, so I'm kind of my eyes are moving around a little bit. Sorry about that. I should have planned a little bit better or practiced a little bit instead of having to look at one thing and then another. Apache Highlands ecoregion, as you can see, is a big chunk of area, about 12 million hectares, and this northern Sierra Madre Occidental. Sierra Madre Occidental is the big mountain chain that stretches up the sort of the western portion of Mexico into the southwestern United States, and this is the northern bit of it. As I recall, the ecologists at TNC kind of clipped it because they wanted to keep it more in the borderlands area for a few sort of practical reasons. It's a Sky Islands area, and these types of areas, and there are a few of them that are like this. Another one is the area of Tepuys in eastern Venezuela and the Gran Sabana. You get these sort of flat grassland areas, and then you get these high sort of mountainous inclusions, I guess, for lack of a better word, since I'm sadly not a geologist. But in any event, you get a bunch of different habitat. You get a bunch of different altitudinal change over relatively short horizontal changes, and as a result, you just get a lot of different biodiversity. So in this ecoregion, for instance, there's a couple thousand plant species. There's 110 mammal species, nearly 300 bird species, nearly 300 snail species as well. A lot of things. One thing people don't know is a lot of animals, in particular, that are associated with water, tend to be really diverse in this particular area along the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and in northern Mexico because of some of the remnants of the geologic past. In some cases, the distant geologic past. I suspect that's where the snails are coming from. 75 reptile species as well. So the Conservancy recognized this as a pretty important area, and as a result decided to do an ecoregional plan of it, try to identify basically conservation priorities, locations where these conservation priorities occurred, and then develop basically an approach to sort of conserve the essence of the biodiversity. So if they could come up with a conservation plan, management plan, that would maintain the key biodiversity in this area, it would in essence be representative of what was going on in that ecoregion, recognizing that we can't conserve everything. They came up ultimately with 90 potential conservation sites during this ecoregional plan, which was led by TNC and a guy named Rob Marshall, who had done one in the Sonoran Desert a couple years earlier. He's the guy that basically, I think very courageously in some ways, called for me to come in, because TNC at that point in time was kind of taking baby steps in terms of the human population and the human impact issues. And they had a co-teammate called IMADES, which is the Mexican or Spanish acronym for a kind of a sustainable development organization. Does a lot of environmental work in the state of Sonora and Hermosillo in particular. So they work in a lot of northwestern Mexico, and then several other partners as well, including Arizona. I think it's Fish and Wildlife. But Rob Marshall and his partners, I think, did a really first-rate job of this. Here's some pictures of what some of these sky islands look like, so you can see some of the. I'm sorry they're so small. It's part of my wise choice of using portrait, but you can see a lot of the altitudinal variation, which lies at the base of some of the high biodiversity. This is what the place looks like. Excuse me, in black and white once again. You can sort of see in general where it's located. You can also see some of the major settlements in the area. None of them are the real big ones. Tucson, just outside of the ecoregion, is probably it's by far and away the largest human settlement. Nogales is also there, and just on the Mexican side. There's 4 states, 2 of them in the United States, 2 of them in Mexico. So it's Arizona, New Mexico, the state of Sonora, and Chihuahua, and in Mexico itself. And what I did was I wanted to get an idea of basically how this type of biodiversity evolved in a human context, and so I wanted to understand a little bit more about the human context. I was an archaeologist in my misspent youth. I'm probably one of the few people in this room who could make that claim. So I looked at, there's another, my gosh. We'll have to go tell stories later. It's amazing. In any event, so what I did is I basically looked at some of the archaeological data to get an idea of what was going on in the past, some of the historical demography as well, and then sort of traced it up to the present. And when you do that, you find that there's settlement in this area going back to about 15,000 years ago. Paleo-Indians is what archaeologists called them. They were more or less big game hunters. Might have been a little bit different here, a little bit more sort of focused on hunter-gatherers. They went through sort of the standard series of development changes, I guess, into something called Mogollon, which was a kind of a smaller scale agricultural development in the area. But none of these really supported huge numbers of population. So you probably had, 10 to tens of thousands of people living in this entire ecoregion, both north and south of what would become the U.S.-Mexico border. Fast forward to after World War II, when the Southwest started developing very quickly, and northwestern Mexico did as well, in part to be juxtaposed, to have some development juxtaposed with the U.S. Border. In 1990, there's about 569,000 people living in the ecoregion. By 2000, there's 797,000. So there's a 40% increase in only 10 years. So things were really screaming. And we did this ecoregional plan between 2001 and 2004. So we're basically going into this situation knowing that there's huge amount of growth in population. And there was a great deal of concern about it, especially by Rob and some of his senior science folks. I do population mapping, among other types of mapping, and so what I'll show is a few population maps here real quickly. I usually map density, and I usually map it in fairly small units. Rich was mentioning that density is one of the key factors that we wanted to look at here. I've got something called block groups north of the border, and something called basic geostatistical areas, and in the Mexico side. They're of comparable size in the Mexican units. These AJEBs, there is the Spanish acronym, are the smallest units that one can get in Mexico. So as a result, I basically used that to kind of dictate what was going on, since I was sort of working in both countries. You can see that there's generally sparse population for the most part in the region, with a few concentrations, and that's the sort of the way that it had developed, at least, and that's the way that it was developing. So a lot of the population problems were sprawling around some larger settlements, including Tucson, and you'll see Tucson sort of, well, you can sort of see Tucson right there, sort of sprawling into the ecoregion a little bit. I try to add a little dynamic quality to it as well. So I look at population change. This is, once again, since we were working on this in the first half of 2000 to 2010, the first half of the first decade of the 21st century. So I was looking at 1990 to 2000 population change in that case. Map on the this would be sort of a green and red map had I had time to change it, but instead it's two maps. The one on the left shows population growth, where darker is faster growth. The one on the right shows population decline, where darker is faster population decline. So they're kind of two opposites, and they should complement one another perfectly if I did them correctly. And what you see is that there's a lot of growth in the U.S. portion of the ecoregion, and there's a lot of population decline for the most part in the Mexico portion of the ecoregion. There's a lot of concentration in the Mexican side, so you've got some sort of rural to urban migration probably going on, but you also get a huge chunk of people just moving in to the American side from other places. If you look at data from at the county level, this is for in-migration between 1995 and 2000. You find that then the darkest shaded areas, which are a lot of the ones in the northern part of the ecoregion, that more than 25 or more than 24% of the population aged 5 years and above who were living there in 2000 had moved from someplace else over the past 5 years. So there's remarkably rapid population in-migration going on. There's some in-migration going on in Mexico. We're not accounting for out-migration, and so some of the population decline is probably happening there. But the main driver is this mobility, and mobility is a major consideration in a lot of ways in conservation, I think, because whereas high fertility can create population growth over generations, high mobility can create population growth in the matter of months in some cases, or years, and it's very difficult to deal with. And from the conservation side, when one day an area is virtually unpopulated, and 2 months later the area is very, very heavily populated, as one sees in a lot of cases with some refugee movements, such as around the Virunga volcanoes in Africa. This is a map that shows the 90 potential conservation sites, kind of the amorphous little polygons stuck around there, dropped on top of the population density. And one thing that one sees here that I'll confirm in a second is that a lot of these conservation sites occur in areas where there's not very high population density. Population density data tend to be available for a lot of different places, so being able to come up with some sort of an indicator, some sort of a link between these two is a pretty important thing, and I don't know that we've really fully been able to do that. I'll have some comments about that as sort of being ecologically and sort of context specific later, but certainly for this, in this case, there does seem to be a very strong correlation. We also see that there's a connection between, in some cases, population growth. This is average annual population growth. Same two maps that I showed before, basically, with the conservation sites dropped on top of them. There's a lot of population growth, rapid population growth, in areas where there are these conservation sites as well. A lot of times that would be a concern. However, one has to sort of combine these two. Let me see if I can. So basically combine this map and these maps, because if you've got really sparse population but it's growing really rapidly, the impacts on biodiversity may be fairly small. On the other hand, if you've got a fairly large population that's growing much more slowly, but it's still growing, the impacts might indeed be important. In any event, what I did was I sort of combined these things in a sense. And I looked at the data, and it turns out that of the 90 potential conservation sites, 84 of them had population densities that were 10 people per square kilometer or less. Then they would go up to about 16. There were 5 of them that went up from about 10 to about 8, actually from about 8 to about 16 kilometers square, 16 people per square kilometer. And then there was one that was quite dense. It's in Mexico, sort of in the western portion of the Mexican part of the ecoregion. So what I thought is, well, gosh, it looks like this 10 persons per square kilometer might be a reasonable cutoff, at least empirically, for this particular setting. What did that look like in 2000? And indeed, if we projected population to 2010, what would it look like then? If everything that was 10 people or more was kind of off limits or was going to be impacting biodiversity. And when we do that, we sort of find these darkest areas, sort of the medium dark and the darkest areas, as areas that are of particular concern. Those are areas that I was recommending in the ecoregional plan should be looked at in particular over the ensuing 5 years, I guess, in that first decade of the 21st century, to see if we could get some sort of a handle on, did we really want to go after some of these sites? And if we did want to go after these sites, how exactly were we going to do it? So those were sort of places that, at least from the human development perspective, were important. And you can see that there's a lot of sprawl that's occurring from Tucson, for instance, into the area. You can see a little bit of this is sort of the Nogales area here, sort of expanding in as well, and then a little bit in the northern part of the ecoregion as well. There are some smaller communities in Arizona. I'm going to rush through the Madagascar thing real quickly, since I was sure that I could get through the other one more quickly than I did. My co-authors on this were Catherine Corson, Ken Chomitz, Grady Harper, Miro Honzak, and Burke Osler. Catherine was an intern at the World Bank at the time and actually ran the statistics on this. We did a multivariate probit model, which I'll show you in a second. Chomitz and Osler are both economists at the bank. Osler focuses on poverty in particular, and Chomitz is more, I guess, econometrician and sort of does a lot of planning work. Grady Harper's and Ken's not here, I don't think, so I'm probably completely misconstrued what he does. Grady Harper's a remote sensor, and he led or collaborated, I guess, in a study that looked at deforestation in Madagascar between 1990 and 2000. And Miro Honzak is also a remote sensor. Both of them, Harper and Honzak, at Conservation International at the time. But Miro set up a lot of the analyses using GIS for Catherine to run. So there was a kind of and then I wrote the paper. So there was a lot of people involved in this. I think a lot of you already realize that Madagascar is a mega diverse place. So there's a huge amount of biodiversity there. It's been separated from the main continent of Gondwanaland, which included part of Africa between 70 and 160 million years ago, and people didn't show up till about 20,000 years ago. So there was a lot of time for a lot of things to happen. There's enormous endemism there, plants that and animals that are found only in Madagascar. Not only the lemurs, and I have to confess, I had written 33 lemur species here, but I know they found several since then, but 30-some, I think. I don't think it's exceeded 40 yet. But there's nearly 11,000 plant species, 215 amphibian species, 300 species of reptiles, and more than 100 species of birds, all found only on Madagascar, as well as all the other stuff. So that's pretty remarkable, and you can sort of see some of the photos here. There's a painted mantella frog, a black and white ruffed lemur, and the baobab trees, and so on and so forth. It's a two-edged sort of thing there. It's a two-pronged challenge because there's also considerable poverty. The GNI per capita in the first decade of the 21st century is about $290 U.S. Headcount poverty rate from when they did the study of that, which was actually in the 1990s, was 70. It was more than 70%. I think population is probably on the order of about 17 million right now. The last census, it was around 12.3 million. It was growing at about 2.7% annually. So there's a fair amount of population growth, and there's a lot of poor people. This is what it looks like and how we broke it down regionally. We actually did a study of the entire island as well as regionally, looking at the relationship between population and other variables, and I'll tell you about those in a second. And deforestation, recognizing that a lot of the major a lot of the major biodiversity in Madagascar is associated with forest ecosystems. So the deforestation thing is a huge deal, and Madagascar has lost a lot of its forest. This is a population map shown at the Farizana level. That's the units, the smallest units that we have available for Madagascar. Darker is higher density, lighter is lesser density. You can see a big concentration of population density in the Central Highlands around the capital and also along the East Coast. The East Coast has had a lot of the forest, sort of the eastern portion of the island, eastern third or so, and a lot of that's been lost. So that's important to see as well. And you'll also notice when we show this next one, which is deforestation, that there's relatively little spatial association between where the deforestation is occurring between 1990 and 2000. They lost 8,100 square kilometers of forest in that period, and population density. So if we bounce back here, you see this big chunk of population, dense population in the central portion of the highlands, east central portion of the highlands, I guess, and along the East Coast. And when you go to the next one, you see that the deforestation in that area is much less, and it's much heavier down in the southwest and up in a certain extent in the northwest. So we were thinking, wow, something's going on here, maybe other than just population. And we think we were right. So what we did is use a multinomial or multivariate probit model, and I don't want to get all statistical on everyone. Basically what we said is it's like a multiple regression, if any of you can remember that from your statistics courses way back when. Only instead of looking at a continuous variable as a dependent variable, in this case deforestation, the first thing D with a star next to it, it's looking at that as being either a binary variable, so it's either deforested or it's not deforested. It was done by 30 by 30 meter pixels for the entire country. We measured several other things as well, or we considered several other things in the process of putting this model together to see what was going to hang together statistically and what wasn't. So we had population density, distance to nearest road, distance to nearest footpath, mean monthly household expenditure, household income inequality, topographic slope, so on and so forth. You can read the rest of them. Sorry about reading them to you. Sometimes it's just too darn tempting. And in any event, so we basically ran this model to see exactly what would fall out statistically, what seemed to be major movers or drivers of deforestation, and what were maybe sort of lesser drivers. We looked at something called marginal values, which is technically the change in the predicted probability of deforestation through the unit change in one variable, holding the others constant. So basically we would hold the others constant at their mean values and then move one or the other either up or down a certain unit to see what the impact would be. Well, actually the program does that, and then I found it in the results. And what you find, as you can see here, is that some things are actually quite important. Being in a protected area generally would lead to lessened deforestation, about a 61.5% decrease in being in a protected area versus not being in a protected area. Distance to footpath and distance to road, so accessibility was also a key player here. Things that weren't key players, a lot of the other things weren't, and some of the other things were as well. For instance, slope was important, elevation was fairly important as well. Population was not necessarily important. So you can have an increase in 10 persons per square kilometer, and you'd see an increase in deforestation of about 1.7%, the likelihood of deforestation in one particular pixel, one of these little analytical units. But when you figure that all told, the average population density in Madagascar is only 15 people per square kilometer. Increasing it by 10 across the board would be a lot. It's a big change. Similarly, if you increase mean monthly expenditures, so basically an increase in income by 100,000 Malagasy francs, then you decrease deforestation by 5.2%. However, that's about 1/3 of the average Malagasy household income. So it would be a huge increase in income for a relatively modest decrease in deforestation. the bottom line here, I think, is that at least for us, is that population was not quite enough, that we had to look at other things as well. And in this case, access was an important thing in particular. Access either by virtue of the fact of being able to go into a park to harvest forest products, protected area that is, or being able to get to a place and maybe haul the stuff out by virtue of having access to a footpath or a road. So this was those were important features. Now all these things certainly sort of kind of combined to tell the story, at least as far as we were concerned for Madagascar, but one of them in and of themselves, I guess, wasn't sufficient, possibly with the exception of the protected areas. Of course, as a lot of you know, there's been a coup in Madagascar. There's a lot of I guess we would say selective harvesting of things illegally in protected areas now. So sort of all bets are off, not all bets, a lot of bets are off in terms of how useful the protected areas are working out as well. One of the things that's important about this as well, and one of the things that the World Bank guys were pointing out in particular, because they were quite excited about these results, is that footpaths, roads, and protected areas are all policy decisions. So when the World Bank or another bilateral or multilateral decides that they're going to invest in development in a place like Madagascar, they can look at some of these sorts of indicators and some of these sorts of investments as being important or not important in terms of potentially helping to stem the tide of deforestation or not. So anyway, summing up briefly, and I'm running I think I'm almost on time, but maybe a little bit, maybe 25 minutes into this. Sorry about that. Population density seems to be a reasonable indicator of biodiversity loss. Certainly in the case of the Apache Highlands in particular, we had a little better control both temporally and spatially of the data. Sparse generally is good for biodiversity. Really dense generally isn't good. So I mean, one can go outside of this building and despite the fact that my friends at Conservation International, the bird people, used to be able to go out and touch the building we were in, which is right around actually the 19th and M, so not too far away from here, and spot birds, and they had 40 or 50 species, some enormously large number of birds. At least I thought it was large for being in a downtown area. Densely populated areas such as this generally aren't that good for biodiversity. One of the questions remains, I guess, what's going on in the middle? Sort of where is the threshold? Is there a threshold or isn't there? I've looked at this. I haven't done a careful review of the literature in the past couple of years. Other people have used this 10 people per square kilometer, which is about 25 people per square mile, as an aside for those of you who aren't comfortable in the metric stuff. And that may be something that works. It certainly worked in this area at least, but the degree to which it would work in a mixed deciduous forest or in a tropical forest or another type of ecosystem, or with people doing other types of things, it's completely up in the air in my mind. So I think you do need to study these things in some cases, case by case. In some cases, it's more than just population. So what people are doing is crucial as well. There are places in the Apache Highlands, for instance, that have one half person per square kilometer as population density, but they're agricultural. And commercial agriculture tends to be bad for biodiversity as well. So you can drop down fairly low in the population density and still have some activities that are causing some problems. There are other instances of that are examples that I won't bore you with right now. The access is sort of an important bit also, we thought, certainly coming out of the Madagascar study. I mentioned sort of a second ago just that every locality likely has a kind of a different story to tell, and I think in some ways, and Richard mentioned this in the introduction, you can do things at different sorts of scales, but in some cases you need to sort of do kind of context-specific studies to get a real handle for what we think is going on. And finally, one of the things that the mantras that I keep telling students is that planned solutions based on strategic actions increasingly are essential. I think in a world where we're approaching 7 billion people and we may top out at 9.1 or 9.2, depending on the fertility estimates that one goes with. It's the days of basically letting nature take care of itself probably are gone, and we need to be very, very careful about what we do if we want to maintain biodiversity in the context of climate change, in the context of increasing per capita demand, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to sort of watch these things very carefully. I think population is going to be a key factor in that, but it's probably going to be a factor that you want to roll in with some other things. That's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Chris, should we tee you up and we'll have all three and then chance for discussion? I think if you hit escape, maybe.
Hit escape first. Yeah.
You've just seen the whole talk. Backwards. Okay. Thank you all for inviting me down here and for your heroic efforts to make this book happen. Thank you all for coming and for sticking around this long. I'll try and make it worth your while for staying at least this far. The question that we wanted to address with this chapter is summed up here. Where is everyone? We wanted to sort of set the stage for the more detailed studies that the other authors did by taking a look at the global distribution of human population, not only geographically as you see here, but also in non-geographic space, say environmental parameter space. Where are people relative to different environmental, climatic, landscape environments? So most of the results that I'm going to show you here came out of an analysis or a series of analyses that Joel Cohen and I did back in the late 1990s. And that came as a result of, I met Joel at a seminar that he gave on mathematical population analysis. And after the seminar, over beer, we came across the question of, I'm a geophysicist, and I do a lot of work in coastal areas, and Joel's a population ecologist, mathematical ecologist, demographer. And he raised the question of the number of people who live close to sea level. At the time, we used to hear this statistic that 3/4 of the world's population lives in coastal zones, and that neither one of us had ever actually seen any analysis that was based on. It was just sort of thrown out like it was as if it were biblical or something. And I had always assumed that the ecologists had done the analysis, and as Joel always assumed that the geoscientists had done the analysis, and it turned out that neither one of us knew who had done it. So we dug around a little bit and couldn't find the basis of the numbers. So we decided to do the analysis ourselves using the methods, I'm not going to get into the methods that we used, but that analysis was the basis of the analyses or the results that I'm going to show you here in terms of how we look at population distribution relative to different environmental parameters. So this is the way I guess most of us are used to seeing the world's population on a map distributed geographically. What you see here, this is actually a gridded compilation of census data taken from all over the world. And so it shows the distribution of population in more detail than what is usually shown in, say, geography textbooks. The important things to note here are, things we're all aware of. First of all, there's an enormous range of going from very low population densities to some very high population densities. That range is, at the very least, 5 orders of magnitude. This is based on actual numbers, compilations of census data gridded into population density. Now, I say at least because at the low end, of course, as you go to lower and lower densities, it becomes harder and harder to measure, and so the range goes up. But for our purposes, 5 orders of magnitude. And it varies quite a bit in space and time. I'm not going to talk about time today, but in space we can see even over fairly small distances. For instance, if we look at the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta and the Ganges Plain in South and East Asia, we see some of the highest population densities on Earth going fairly abruptly to some very low population densities. And just looking at a map, it's not, unless you're very familiar with the geography, it's not necessarily obvious why that is. And so this is the sort of question that we wanted to address that we thought might be helpful to set the stage for some of the other chapters in the book. So as we zoom in, again, the colors go from cooler to warmer in factors of 10 in terms of population density. And if we zoom in very close, this is what the delta looks like. This is Dhaka, Bangladesh. This is Kolkata, India. According to the World Bank, Dhaka is the most densely populated city in the world. And yet, if you go just a short distance away over into the Chittagong Hills here, you come to areas that are effectively almost uninhabited. And so, as an example of the way that this can change in space, this is an example. Have done and continue to do field work in Bangladesh on the rivers and on the deltas. I've seen some of these examples firsthand. And this is a photograph taken in downtown Dhaka. Here's an area in downtown Dhaka that's totally unpopulated because it's water. A certain population density here, I don't know what it is. The census in Dhaka doesn't have this amount of detail. But within each of these homes here, you'd have a certain number of people. And then off in the distance, you actually have considerably higher population density in plan view because people are stacked up. But if you were to look at a volume, the size of one of these rooms in any of these buildings, it's a pretty safe bet that it wouldn't be nearly as dense at that scale. So the point here is that thinking about population density, the scale really matters, and the time frame really matters as well. So this is an example of by any means two densely populated areas, but differing in the density structure. Now, about a day's drive from there, we come over. This is a place called Sirajganj Ghat on the Brahmaputra River. And this is the Union Station of Sirajganj. This is where the boats leave from. This is pretty early in the morning, so the density isn't that high here at this point. But as you can guess, it gets quite a bit higher later in the day when more people arrive to take the boats to various places on the river. And this environment here is fairly typical. It's a lot of sand, it's a very active river, a lot of erosion and deposition going on. And so the population tends to be even more clustered in the areas where they can actually grow something. And if we go another day's drive further away, this is the Sundarbans, the giant forest at the mouths of the Ganges. And these areas here are effectively uninhabited. There are a very small number of people living here, mostly on boats. So this is what we start out looking at. This is the gridded population density again. And in this case, it's the number, the count is for each of these administrative units is uniformly distributed across the area of the administrative unit. Now we know that's not realistic, but it's sort of an end member. It's as dispersed as people can get within the constraints of the administrative unit. So this is sort of a maximum dispersal model. And you still see the orders of magnitude, again, the full 5 orders of magnitude density here, this time in gray shading. Now, the other thing that we looked at is an indicator. We wanted to get a little more detail. So we also looked at nightlights. So this is what the same place looks like as seen at night. This is actually a composite over 1 year. And what this shows us within the same area is where within these areas the population is very densely clustered. And now, of course, the people themselves don't emit the light. Obviously, it's the development, primarily outdoor lighting, lighted infrastructure that's responsible for the light that we see here. So this is, in some sense, is a proxy for development. But these two data sets give us a way to look at both the spatial distribution of people at a certain level of detail and the spatial distribution of development or investment in infrastructure. And so we looked at these quantities relative to both landscape characteristics and climatic characteristics. So what you see here are 3 measures of proximity of cities in the upper row, or lighted areas, I should say, in the upper row, and then population in the lower row. And looks like it's cut off the. This is a good reason to look at the chapter in the book, because you can actually see the axes, the labels on the axes here. But this is numbers of lighted settlements, so spatially contiguous lighted areas. You can call them cities, blobs, whatever you prefer. And these are numbers of people in millions. And so what we see, this quantifies something that probably comes as no surprise to us, is that people and settlements, investments in infrastructure, tend to cluster close to rivers, at low elevations, and close to the coastline. The difference here is that these are actual measurements. At the time we did this, these were not only the most accurate, I think they were the only actually quantified estimates that were available. And so this gives us a way of quantifying how people are distributed relative to these different environmental or landscape physiographic parameters. And it turns out that the number that was being thrown around, 3/4 of the world's population, well, they never defined what they meant by coastal zone, so that makes it a little easier. But we looked at where the places where the gradient fell off the most steeply and said, well, for the sake of argument, this will give us a conservative estimate. We'll call that the coastal zone, since that's where the density falls off. And it turns out that the number was about half of what was being claimed, even with a conservative estimate. So this is how I justify spending a year or 2 of my life doing what were some kind of tedious analyses. And these plots don't really encompass the tedium of actually compiling these numbers. I can't really, there's nothing I can say that can convey it. But anyway, I'm really, really happy that we didn't get exactly the same number that the made-up number was. That would have too much to bear. Okay, and this is a similar sort of analysis that we did for climatic parameters. Now, we looked at a number of climatic parameters. The chapter in the book actually considers several, but these are just the 2 that we're most familiar with. The simplest things that most of us think of in terms of what determines our climate is what's the temperature and how much precipitation do we get. And so this is actually a density shaded scatter plot. The lighter the color, the more people live at that particular combination of annual average temperature and annual average precipitation. And so for comparison, here's a standard a biome graph showing the sort of the common names of the different environments that occur at these combinations of temperature and precip. And what you see here is that people are all over the place. At some density, humans inhabit almost every environment on Earth. And while there are some that are more densely populated than others, there are quite a few if you compare these 2. So the take-home message from this is that people are all over the place, but not evenly distributed. And I have to be careful how I say this so that I don't lapse into inadvertent determinism, but the environments where people live are more strongly correlated and associated with features on the landscape than they are with climatic parameters. So, since these things co-occur, you can say that the people who are living in, let's say, this biome here are very likely clustered in certain areas within that biome, in part related to what the landscape characteristics are. So this is, believe it or not, this is your reward for sticking around this long, at least from me. This is where you get your cocktail party statistics to take home and shock your friends and amaze your family with. This is the 2 measures of non-uniformity of distribution. On the left, you see the distribution of population, so the total number of people as a function of the population density at the scale at which it was measured by the census. And on the right, you see the distribution of lighted areas. You can think of these as cities. They're actually larger than cities. They're contiguously developed lighted areas. And what you see here is that most people in the world live at densities between about 100 and 1,000 people per square kilometer, but we have this very heavy tail out here that I think most of us here probably live in or on the edge of, reaching out to the higher densities. And so if we construct a Lorentz curve, a measure of the non-uniformity of distribution, we sum this up, integrate it from low population, low densities up to high. If people were uniformly distributed, then 50% of the population would occupy 50% of the land area, 75 on 75, 80 on 80. But we're not. And the more non-uniform the distribution, the more curvature. And so here's your first cocktail party statistic, is according to our analysis, at least half the world's population, circa, this is 1990, we've done it again for 2000 and got basically the same result. Circa 1990 or 2000, at least half the world's population lived on less than 3% of the inhabited land area. So that's excluding ice sheets and the middle of the Sahara Desert. At least half on less than 3%. In terms of the developed areas that are brightly enough lighted they can be detected from space, this is a count of the total number of, I'll just call them cities here, developed areas, as a function of the size, the equivalent diameter. They're not circles almost ever, but if you were to shape the equivalent area into a circle, the diameter gives you a measure of the size, the scale across. And what we see is that most lighted settlements are less than 20 kilometers in diameter. But about half of the lighted area in the world, half of the heavily developed area in the world, is at considerably larger scales. And to drive that point home now, we'll get into the last part here. For the statistically inclined speed readers in the audience who absolutely must have all the details, well, this isn't even all of the details. This is just as much as I could cram onto one slide using the smallest type font I thought I could get away with. Fortunately, you don't need to read all of this, but what we're looking at here are a series of what are called rank size plots. So if you imagine taking, let's start with the lighted areas. We have these images of lighted areas, and above a certain brightness, areas are spatially contiguous. So you can say we're only going to consider areas that are lighted above a certain average brightness, and we'll look at the contiguous lighted areas, we'll measure the size of each one, and then we'll sort this list of lighted areas by size, going from the rank number 1 is the largest, 2 is the second largest, and so on. And we'll look at the size versus the rank. And we did the same thing with population density. We said, okay, well, since we don't actually have any agreed upon definition of what determines a city in terms of population density, we'll just slice the data at different density levels, and we'll say that everything above a certain density constitutes some settled area. And we did this for a number of different brightness levels for lights, density levels for population. I should say before I forget, this is more recent work done with my colleagues Deborah Balk, Chris Elvidge, Mark Montgomery. And this is working its way through the system now, so this is fresh. So we plot these two different measures or two different criteria for settlement size for different thresholds. So you can sort of choose what you think is a reasonable threshold. And in each case, when we plot these rank size plots on in log-log space, we get, in some cases, fairly straight lines. And this is an observation that goes back about 100 years now. I think it's 100 years and 2 years from now, that it's commonly referred to as Zipf's law. It applies to both frequency of usage of words as well as city size distributions. And traditionally, this is done using population counts, tabulated population counts. And there's this observation that when you make this sort of rank size plot, you very often get a straight line with a slope of -1. And to mathematicians, statistical physicists, statisticians, ecologists, some ecologists, this is compelling because it seems to suggest some sort of underlying order. And yet, so far, there's no consensus on an explanation for why this occurs. It's been observed to be fairly robust at the level of individual countries, but not all countries. But it doesn't work globally. And we think the reason it doesn't work globally has to do with the way census data are collected and analyzed. And so this is why we did it this way. And so what we get out of this is we see that depending on the slope you choose, or the threshold you choose, we get a pretty linear relationship, but the slope changes for both lights and population density. If we look at how the slope varies, and this is the part you shouldn't look at too closely unless, well, I'd be happy to explain it later. I won't get into it now. We see that the slope depends on where you put the threshold, but for a wide range of densities and brightnesses, we get slopes pretty close to -1. So it seems to suggest that this controversial law may actually hold at global scales as well as at continental scales. These are individual continents that we did the analysis for. And so here's the other, and this is the last slide, so congratulations, you've made it this far. What we didn't know what to expect in terms of the result. We figured it would be inconclusive. It turns out it's a lot more conclusive than we thought in terms of the robustness of the slope and the fit of the distributions. What we found, though, is something interesting is when you look at these, let me back up for a second. The other interesting thing here that you probably can't see very well, the exponents here. The largest of these clusters are much larger than individual cities. This is 10 to the 7th square kilometers. So this is, here is 1 million square kilometers going down by factors of 10. Observations in the order of tens of thousands of observations for each of these. So to give you an idea, New York City sits right around here, the 5 boroughs. So what we're looking at here aren't individual cities. They're giant spatial networks of either population density above some threshold or light brightness above some certain threshold. But this Zipf's law that had been controversial in terms of cities and yet unexplained looks like it extends beyond cities to incorporate, to encompass these enormous spatial networks of both population and development or brightness of nightlight. The interesting thing, or the other interesting thing, is if we look at where the largest of these networks occur, they're almost geographically exclusive. Population density, the largest spatially contiguous networks of population density, Central Plateau of Mexico, East Coast of Brazil, African highlands, and over here in West Africa. The Ganges Plain in southern India, Sichuan Basin in the North China Plain, Java. Enormous, on the order of 1 million square kilometers, some of these. If we look at where the largest networks of development are, they're about where we would expect. Except in the case of the US, it's not just the Northeast Corridor. The Northeast Corridor is actually connected up to the network of development through the Great Lakes. Central Europe, although much of France is not connected. I'm not going to make any comment on that. But, the Punjab in northern India and Pakistan. And we see in China the networks are much smaller. There is a big one in the North China Plain, but it's not nearly as big as the network of high population density with lower levels of development. And then, of course, South Korea and Japan. So I'm going to stop there and leave you hanging with a curious observation.
Thank you very much, Chris. Well, thank you, Rich, Larry, and Chris. You've given us, obviously, an awful lot to think about, a tremendous set of contributions. Why don't we have some questions for a discussion period, and we can throw it open to the floor. And we do have microphones that we ask that you use because we are webcasting this session, so that folks can watch the video online. Who would like to kick us off in terms of a question? Thank you, Tom. Sir,
Yes.
we'll get you a microphone. It's coming to you.
Thank you. Very interesting presentations. Since it's freshest in my mind, I wanted to comment on Christopher Small's presentation. It seems as if the Earth is practicing smart growth in a sense. I mean, what urban, landscape planners really look for in terms of what they're advocating for is greater and greater density. And in fact, I mean, that's a remarkable statistic that 3%, half of the world's population lives on 3% of the inhabitable landmass. That might bode well for the future if population weren't continuing to increase. And I wonder if you've had any thoughts about where those increases are actually taking place and whether that's going to basically change some of those fundamental results that you came up with. I've heard, some of it's anecdotal, but some of it's being documented that in the Amazon rainforest, that urbanization trends are actually depopulating some of that rainforest, which is good news for biodiversity. But overall, adding 1 billion and then another 1 billion to the world's population is probably going to take away any of the benefits of this urbanization trend. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
And sir, if you could just let us know who you are.
Yes, I'm Don Whedon. I'm sorry. Don Whedon of the Whedon Foundation.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Predicting future population growth is a good example of a task that I consider beyond my pay grade. I felt like I was a bit out on a limb even doing these analyses, but thankfully I had colleagues who know these areas better than I do. But so in terms of speculating about future population growth, I think there's too many things that can impact it on short time scales. So one thing I would say, though, is that the patterns that we see now are the integrated result of all the population growth that's gone on up until now. And in terms of the power law observation, Zipf's law, the earliest observation of that pattern was made more than 100 years ago for cities in Germany. And Latka and then Zipf later did similar analyses for the U.S. looking at the change through time and found very, very good agreement for the United States for something like 150 years worth of census data. So it seems to suggest that at least some aspects of the spatial distribution of people are persistent as growth occurs. So and the current trend, as we're aware, is in the form of increasing density and clustering, with mass migrations to cities. So, if urban environments are as efficient as they're believed to be now, then I guess you could interpret that as good news. That's the way I would choose to look at it, since I live in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Might I? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Is that?
They stay on.
Okay. Just as an aside, increasingly I think that it's certainly important where people live and what they develop, but also there's an increasing geographic fluidity of impact or whatever, such that you can have concentrations of people in one place impacting a place that's very different. As a case in point, I work in south central Tanzania on one project, and I've got another project I'm working on in western Cambodia. And in both cases, one they're very rural, very, very rural areas, but you see huge amounts of charcoal going out of these places to the cities, to Phnom Penh in the case of Cambodia, and to Dar es Salaam in the case of Tanzania. And some of the charcoal that's coming out of Tanzania, although most of this is from the north, but some of it's coming up, I think, out of the south central portion as well, is going to the Middle East because people like to, sort of barbecue things there. So in fact, although it's important where you live and what habitat you're sort of impacting directly, there's a lot of these indirect impacts. And we saw the same thing in the Madagascar work, because a lot of the deforestation is probably coming from the charcoal industry to provide cooking fuel for communities, which basically cities which rely largely on charcoal for that. So it's important to know where it's happening, but it's the total number, in a sense, is increasingly becoming what the driving factor is in a lot of biodiversity impact, at least in my mind.
Yeah, well, can I add, from a demographic standpoint, at least going along with what the UN Population Division projects, is that all growth, almost all growth, will be in cities, but that's largely because not only will cities be growing about 1.5 times the background rate of the country, but also areas that are nearby will reach thresholds by which they will become cities. So it's not exactly as it looks, but in essence, you're right that there's kind of a self-organizational property to urbanization. That interesting, I think, I'm just doing a review of urbanization, and there's this thing which I call the urban growth ratio, and that, if you look across most countries, despite the fact that countries have defined urban differently, you see this thing where urban growth is 1.2 to 1.8 times the country growth. So as country growth actually slows down, then so does urban growth slow down. Even though we think of that as an individual decision, we're going to the city, it looks like there's just this pattern that goes on. So you can see the trend is going to, urbanization is going to pick up in Asia, of course, and in Africa, where most of the growth is going on. And as Asia slows down, urbanization should slow down as well.
I think Larry's point about the charcoal is an interesting one vis-a-vis this kind of, is it good news or is it bad news vis-a-vis the urbanization question. I mean, we just had a session a couple months ago where Jason Bremner and David Lopez Carr and Liza Grandia were here, and who wasn't in the room, but it was an interesting point of kind of discussion back and forth, is actually one of Chris's colleagues, Ruth DeFries, who's saying it's those wealthier urban populations and their demand for agricultural products that are actually what explains tropical deforestation, is the largest contributor to it, versus some of what Liza and David's points in part was yes, but maybe secondary forest versus primary, and it's still some of those. It's a smaller group, but still heavy impacts in terms of some of those rural, often indigenous, still high TFR rate land use change that is in some of the more primary growth. So it's I think Larry's right. It's a complicated mix that we can't just assume that it's good news, but there's some really different things going on at the same time that make it a difficult story, and that means we can't ignore any of these population centers, even when they're large or small, vis-a-vis their resource use and impact. Jason?
Jason Brennan from Population Reference Bureau. I had a similar question on the process of urbanization and whether any of the chapters were really looking at temporal urbanization over time and the impacts on biodiversity and so on.
The one Baltimore,
okay.
Greater Baltimore study is specifically on that issue.
Okay, great. That would be good to look at. I think that from my own work and some things I've observed lately, I think this question of urbanization, especially in developing countries, where the form of urbanization, as you mentioned, is not just cities growing, but new places becoming cities. I think those questions remain extremely important. And I think that one thing that we have to ask ourselves at the same time is that the form of urbanization now today is completely, well, I would say it's largely different than has happened in the past, because although you see departures of people from rural areas, their connections to the rural areas are often still very good. The road networks in the Amazon mean that there isn't really a departure of people to the cities. There's just a lot of times a temporal relocation for work, and they're keeping the farm back in the town because they only have to go back there to plant and harvest. And, well, the rain, they don't have to worry about irrigation. So the connections between urban places and rural places are greater today than they have been ever. And I think that those are going to change some of our notions of what urbanization means for biodiversity. People largely say, well, if the world becomes really urban, then biodiversity will be preserved. We'll still be relying on those rural places and those places where there's great biodiversity. And we can't think of the movement of people, as I think your third point was, that activity in areas of low density can be just as influential. And so I think that's just a warning. And my last point is that some strange things going on in urbanization. In Kenya, if you look at Kenya is supposed to be getting more urban. You look at the census from 1990, the most recent one, it is no more urban. In fact, it's less urban. You're like, well, that's not what we're projecting.
Well, there's been a shift to smaller cities, actually, so maybe they're not picking up. Maybe that's going to happen. I don't know. One thing that the chapter in the chapter on Greater Baltimore points out, and studies that group has done in the past, is that I think this reflects what Jeff just pointed out, that there's enormous changes if you take a gradient and you go from the center of a city and you go out to the forest. Enormous changes, even at the microbial level, are occurring that are on this gradient. As you approach the city, even you're 50 miles away from the city, you've changed many of the nematode populations, the earthworm populations. All these things are happening largely because of chemical deposition and housing and road building, changes in the drainage system. So it is really quite remarkable what those, it's really worth a read, that chapter and that body of work. And then when you think in the developing world, I think there was a 1990 study that was done by World Resources Institute that pointed out that there was a 200-kilometer ring around Mumbai where material was coming from largely from forests, and it was reflecting the changes that were reflecting in the countryside. Up to 200 kilometers were largely because of consumption within in Greater Mumbai.
Dan, did you have a question, Heather? Right, Mike, right behind you, and then we'll come over here to Heather.
Okay, I think you, Dan Martin from CI. I was fascinated by what you said, Chris, about that human population concentration, because it's so very similar to the numbers of global species diversity. The biodiversity concentration of more than half of all the known species of plants and animals in less than 2%, at least terrestrial organisms, in 2% of the Earth's land surface. Then what Larry was saying about proximity, it seems to me kind of busts up this analysis where the assumption about the proximity of humans to the natural resources is the problem when we have the rich countries being able to pull resources from much greater distances than, say, in Maharashtra. And the Dutch did a wonderful study about their global footprint and where their lumber came from and where everything else came from. So that gets you in, obviously, into economic geography as well as biogeography. Is that, and you were talking about the power laws that were demonstrated in some of those variables. Are you able to latch on to data that really allow you to start generalizing with those more spread out variables and data from those other fields?
The work that I showed at the end there is the first analysis only came out earlier this year. And in fact, the figure that I showed you is in review right now. So we're just beginning this work, but we haven't looked at material flows yet. We wanted to start with the things that we could measure least ambiguously and go from there. So, but yeah, I agree completely with Larry's point that it's the cities draw from, they have resource catchments that aren't necessarily spatially continuous at all. So that's one set of observations that I showed, but it's certainly not the whole story.
Heather?
Hi, I'm Heather Diagnos, and I work at USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. And this is a question for Larry on Madagascar. I happen to do quite a bit of work in Madagascar, and one of the things I think I know, but I'm not sure I know for sure, about deforestation in Madagascar is that it's not necessarily a question of density, in that it's actually relatively few people who keep going to the boundary of the forest area and cutting down. And in fact, USAID several years ago produced a map that looked at the forest cover and how it reduced over a 50-year period. And you really do see the forest corridors have shrunk to this very narrow band. So in your model where you look at population density as a factor, I think that's one factor, but not the major factor in terms of the relationship between population and deforestation. So I'm not sure, I guess my question to you is there another way to look at that dynamic in a model like you used in your paper, or is that relatively difficult to do?
I suppose we could look at it through some sort of a, maybe kind of like a lagged spatial autocorrelation thing, where basically you look at sort of how correlation occurs sort of over space, where you kind of move things apart in a sense and you sort of remeasure it. I haven't really thought about that much, but your point's well taken. One of the, and getting back, not to beat the charcoal horse to death, but basically when I was learning about Madagascar enough to sort of put this paper together, one of the things that, that a lot of people say is that, well, the situation in Madagascar is pretty straightforward. There's a lot of lateritic soil, and there's and 80% of the population lives in rural settings, and a lot of them do subsistence agriculture. So they do slash and burn. It's in areas that are being just on the edge of of reasonable productivity. They'll slash it, they'll burn it, they'll get 2 or 3 crops of rice or maize, but mostly rice, and then it'll be spent, and then they'll move on and they'll cut more. So initially I sort of thought, well, maybe that was what was going on, and then Catherine Corson, who was at that point in time a graduate student, said, well, actually there's other stuff going on as well, and we started looking a little bit more into the charcoal thing as a case in point. And I also looked at the degree to which population density was sort of a driver for approximate areas. And what you find, and what makes perfect sense, for instance, when I showed that map, those 2 maps that sort of showed where the population density was and then where the deforestation was. And in a lot of cases, the low population density had a lot of deforestation, and the high population density didn't have much. Well, part of the reason is because the forest is already gone in the areas of high population density, so you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be that high. And because of the sort of the distance decay that tends to happen, sort of like with Zipf's law of the law of least effort, I guess, or principle of least effort. People are going to get stuff from closer areas first, and then further away, and then further away still, because it costs them more. So you're absolutely right. In terms of actually sort of pinning that down and modeling it in some sort of a statistical way, I'd have to think about it a little bit more. But the issue that you're talking about, I think, is spot on. I mean, what's going on there? The reason probably that road and footpath access is important is because people are coming in from other places to cut trees to take them out either for timber or for charcoal or for some combination. It's much less of a one explanation fits all. It's not the subsistence agriculturalists that are necessarily driving this. There's a whole bunch of things going on for a whole bunch of different reasons, but timber and charcoal is probably playing a pretty important role. So that's actually a long non-answer to your question, which is what I specialize in now.
You've come up with a new axiom that deforestation occurs where the trees are.
Well, that was tragically, Dan, a revelation for me. You know, I'm looking at it and I read something and I thought, you know, that makes a heck of a lot of sense. You know, if you actually live there, and I'm trying to think of places I've lived where there's an awful lot of population density, and the reason you could build houses is because you cut the trees down either to make space for the house or maybe to build the house out of. So yes, but you're absolutely right.
Gentleman in the back, and then Kathleen.
My name's Tom Fitzwater. I'm with the U.S. Census Bureau, and my group produces international or global subnational population estimates for every country of the world controlled to the current year at the lowest administrative level possible. And, well, by the way, this is mostly directed to Chris. We also produce gridded 100-meter resolution population estimates on an ad hoc basis as we can. So far we've done Haiti, Pakistan, controlled to the most recent census, and now we're working on Rwanda. So I was curious, the gridded data set you were using for your study, is that just the season data set, gridded data set, or is that something that you've developed? And if it is something new, could you just explain it briefly, what resolution it's at and so forth? Thank you.
What I showed you was derived from the Landscan ambient population model, so it's actually a disaggregated. It starts with census data and disaggregates based on distribution of settlements, roads, things like that. We also did the very same analysis. I didn't show it here. We did the same analysis with GPW3, the season data set, and we got comparably good fits for both. The slopes were a bit different at the lower density thresholds because obviously the spatial resolution of the data sets is quite different. We were really surprised actually that we got comparable fits for two very different data sets. But no, the other, developing a new population density model is definitely something that's beyond my pay grade. I'm very grateful to people like you guys for doing it. It really makes life easier for us. So, we also, should also mention, in addition to the nightlights and these two population density data sets, we also did the same analysis for two urban land cover data sets. One derived from satellite mapping of land cover using daytime reflectance imagery, and another composite data set that used a combination of nightlights, built-up area boundaries derived from tactical pilotage charts, higher resolution census data in certain countries. So it's sort of an aggregate that's more detailed, but it's a discrete mask of urban versus rural. And those two products didn't yield good fits to the power law at all. They were all way too small on the large end and the small end. So, and I'm presumably because they're more restrictive definitions of what urban is, and also because they're aggregates of different products. But we did look at a number of different data sets for that analysis.
Kathleen?
Hi, I'm Kathleen Mogelgard with Population Action International, and I had a question, Rich, about your third conclusion, the scale matters conclusion, and how I think you said that local responses or local analyses and effective responses are typically different than analyses and effective responses at higher levels. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit more, or point us toward chapters in the book that spin that out a little bit further, that maybe get at some of the issues of the fluidity of impact like Larry was talking about, and in particular if there are ways that we can be thinking about some of the higher level responses that relate to population projections, for example, the projections that came out last week from the UN that show us a pretty wide variety of population futures depending on changes in fertility over time. And I wondered if you had anything that you could share from what that was done in the book that sort of help us understand those different scales of effective responses that might get at some of the drivers of population and biodiversity connections.
Yeah, I was going to, I think you have to start first at the analytical end, where you look at, someone does a study of, say, a small patch of forest, and they see, something that, some issue about, say, reproduction of a species, or say the impact of humans on that. Now, the response may be to actually work with migrants to try to manage that land. If you go to a regional level, you might get something a lot different, and that is that you might, if you were an agency, you might try to restrict migration rather than work with migrants. See what I mean? So what were you, but Larry had some, even in your study, about looking at different scales.
I tend to, I sort of look at kind of units, and places that I'm analyzing, I guess. And then I try to analyze them at a certain sort of level. So, for instance, we did this when the Madagascar thing was done in 30 by 30 meter pixels, ultimately, although we didn't show that. We have a map of the deforestation, which is actually, those are aggregated into about 10 by 10 kilometer pixels, I think, just so we can map it, because otherwise the thing would be a complete mess and would have probably blown up a computer or a printer or something. Well, first of all, I think that if I understand the question correctly, if you map things at different in different units, if you map things in small units as opposed to larger units, you get a better sense of what's going on in the proximity of one place versus another, both in terms of what's going on demographically, as well as what's going on in terms of what maybe possible cause, action and response might sort of occur. I mentioned in the Apache Highlands thing, I think that I tend to map things in as small units as possible, and I mentioned these basic geostatistical areas in Mexico and block groups, actually, I used in the U.S. You can go down to block levels in the U.S., but they're a lot smaller than the things in Mexico, the units in Mexico, so I basically didn't go down that small. I think it provides a better sense of what's going on as opposed to the kind of the county or the municipality things where things are sort of more smeared spatially. But I would say, I think one paper that you might want to look at in the volume is, I think, a very good paper. In part, and I think it's very good in part because Rich weighed in heavily in editing it. But it's the one on the panda reserve in China. It's very cleverly done, I think. It's a strong team that worked on it anyway. But they look not only at panda behavior, but at a lot of demographic variables, and they use agent-based modeling to sort of get an idea of what's going on there. And they get this agent-based model working, and then they kind of tweak some of the demographic variables to see what the responses are. And it's done at, I think it may be at a community by community level. So they've got the demographics, at least, that they're basing the agent-based model on, sort of from fairly small units. But they've got a lot of good spatial control of the data, and I think as a result, one gets they tell a pretty compelling story about what's going on and what the demographic interface is, I guess, with the biodiversity conservation challenges that they face in this panda reserve. So,
and another example is McKee's paper, from McKee and Chambers' paper. What they do is they at a national level, Madagascar fits very well into this regression that suggests that population is really very important, or it looks like that the number of threatened species, given the richness of Madagascar, has a lot to do with population. Now, you might, from that analysis, suggest that you're concerned about the growth of population in Madagascar, and you may be right. Then you go to the local level, and you see something quite different that is reflected, instead reflects an indirect effect of urbanization. And so that difference at levels, neither of them is particularly wrong. It has to do with what your policy prescriptions are at large and small levels. You see what I mean? That there really are differences that that sort of bubble up from looking, researching, analyzing, and then finally formulating policy prescriptions at different levels of analysis.
I'm afraid we've gone a little over time, but obviously a rich contribution, this new book, Human Population, Its Influences on Biodiversity, one that I'm certain we will be able to use and learn a lot from in the coming months. I want to thank the three of you for coming and sharing such substantive presentations and for some very good questions from the floor. So please join me in thanking our panelists for today's rich discussion.